Hi there, folks. This is part 2 in the series of Nature of Science, AP Biofun with Dr. D. And this is the scientific explanation tool, or how to write conclusions in the CER format, claim, evidence, reasoning. And again, we're going to start with the favorite quote, or our favorite neighbor scientist, Albert Einstein. It is all about curiosity, right? So science is a way to learn about our world, and humans are really curious. We're constantly wondering, pondering, hypothesizing, looking for answers. Every quest for knowledge starts with a question and ends with more questions usually. Hopefully, we'll get an answer to our original question, but usually our investigations yield more questions. The more you know that you don't know. Sometimes we may even have a hypothesis, we may know what the answer is, but sometimes we don't. So the scientific explanation tool really is a framework that will help you write conclusion based on evidence. And it has 4 parts. The first part is the question. You start with a question that you're trying to answer or a problem you're trying to solve, and the question must be testable. The type of question determines also what kind of data we want to collect. The second part is evidence that we gather. This is the data we collect from experiments. Hopefully that data will help us answer the question, but not all data will be useful. The data that will help us answer the question is considered evidence. Reasoning explains why each piece of evidence helps us answer the question. It is a justification that logically will link the answer to the question to the evidence. It shows why the data is evidence to support your claim. And finally, claim really is the answer to your question. It makes a statement that answers the question and addresses the original problem. It is 1 to 2 sentences, really, not more. Okay, so the scientific explanation really is putting it all together: the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning. And a well-written scientific explanation is a logical explanation that includes a claim that is supported with your evidence and reasoning. And each piece of evidence and reasoning is connected to the claim. And 2, it uses appropriate scientific principles in the reasoning. When using scientific principle, we should show how the evidence supports the claim. So a claim, if I can remind you again, is really the answer to your research question. A claim is also a statement of something as a fact, an assertion of truth. And because it is a statement of fact, it needs to be supported by evidence. Okay, so evidence must be appropriate to the question asked. So often this is your data. Evidence must be sufficient, must be enough to support your claim. You can also sometimes use counter evidence. That is evidence that is used to refute the claim, to dismiss the claim, to label it as wrong. Or you can deem evidence as insufficient to support the claim. Now, the latter part is used when you evaluate somebody else's claims. If somebody makes a claim, makes a statement of fact, you can use counter evidence to label that claim as wrong. Or you can say, well, the evidence at hand is not sufficient to support your claim. And you could also say something that a great scientist once said, the late Christopher Hitchens: any claim made without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. That means that if somebody is trying to present something as a statement of truth, as a fact, without giving you supporting evidence, you could dismiss it without having to explain yourself, why am I dismissing it, right? So the reasoning part is the most difficult part usually for students to write. The reasoning part really links the evidence that is used to support the claim to the actual claim. It basically explains why the evidence is evidence. Why can we consider this strong evidence to support our claim? It often includes scientific principles. And this is a template to help you get started, and it is labeled in the order in which we proceed to think about scientific argumentation and to write about scientific argumentation. And in the next slide, I will show you what this order is, but the template here is labeled for you. First, we start with a question, right? Number one is the question. So you need to write your question. Basically, you're choosing a question that you're interested in and that can be tested. Second, you then think about designing and eventually performing experiments to collect and analyze data, and hopefully that data will help you answer the question. So you're going to choose from your data the one that helps you answer the question. You're going to be recording that relevant data under evidence and describing it. For example, plant height increased after 2 weeks as compared to control. So, I'm sorry. So right here in number 2, you're going to be describing the data that you're going to be using as evidence. For each piece of evidence, you have to provide reasoning. You're basically linking the evidence, the data, to the question being investigated. That is your reasoning component. You're going to be carefully examining the data and evidence to help you answer your question. And the answer to your question really is the claim, which you write last. And the claim should be written after you collect and analyze all evidence. Claim should be based on evidence. And the reason I'm showing you this is because often you will see, and even the abbreviation is called SIR, right? The abbreviation is called Claim Evidence Reasoning, when in reality, we write the claim at the very end. We start with a question we're trying to answer, we collect and analyze data and evaluate it and see whether it can be used to answer the question. We describe that data as evidence. Then we do the reasoning part, and only at the end, we're coming up really with a claim, which is the answer to the original question. So claim evidence reasoning should really be question evidence reasoning claim. Okay, so I really want you to pay attention to the fact that claim comes after the evidence and the reasoning parts. Why is that important? Because scientists do not make claims and then look for evidence to support their claims. Scientists form hypotheses, which are possible answers to the questions they're trying to answer, and then design experiments to test these hypotheses. But a claim really is a statement of fact, and it is based on evidence, which means a claim is made after the experiments have been performed, after evidence has been collected, after evidence has been deemed sufficient and strong to support that claim. Okay. How can we get better at writing CERs? Practice, practice, practice. The reasoning part is really the hardest part. Now, when you're writing a reasoning, try to incorporate 2 parts. The first part is, why is the data evidence? Which means validity of data. Discussing experimental design, data collection strategies, the nature of what you're measuring and how it relates to the question you're trying to answer. Example. You're trying to answer the question whether sunlight is required for plant growth, but what you're really measuring is plant height. So you need to explain how plant height relates to the question you're asking, which is plant growth. The second component is scientific principles. How does it make sense with what you already know, with prior scientific knowledge? So let's look at an example of good reasoning. The question is, does adding fertilizer to potted plants help them grow? And here's the experiment. 10 plants of the same type and roughly the same size are potted in identical size pods using the same brand of potting soil, right? So we're trying to keep variables constant. The initial plant height was measured and recorded. Then the plants were placed on a windowsill, which means they would all get equal amounts of sunlight in the same room, ensuring that the same exposure to sunlight, same temperature, same humidity. The 5 plants were watered with 100 milliliters of tap water, and 5 plants were watered with 100 milliliters of fertilizer containing water every 3 days. So the only difference between the two groups of plants is the presence or absence of fertilizer. After 3 months, the plants were measured and the percent increase in height was calculated for each plant. The average height of the fertilizer watered plants was 1.5 times greater than that of the tap watered plants. So based on these results, we're going to write a claim evidence reasoning statement. Evidence. The group of plants watered with tap water showed 15% increase in height over 3-month time period. The percent increase in height for the fertilizer treated plants was 22.5% on average. So here we're describing really the data. We're describing the evidence we have collected during the experiment. Here's the reasoning part. The 10 plants were the same type of plant, of similar size, grown under the same conditions, light, temperature, humidity, soil, except for the presence of fertilizer. Over the same time period, the control group grew by 15%, whereas the fertilizer treated group grew by 23%. This means that the rate of growth for fertilizer treated plant was higher than that of the control group. Now I want you to pause this video and ask yourself the following question. What do you notice is being discussed in the reasoning part? And be specific. What are the components that you notice being discussed in this very, very brief reasoning? Okay, after you spend some time thinking about this, we're going to go to another example. Or rather, the second component of reasoning. How do we incorporate scientific principles? If you're not an AP student, maybe you can say this. In order for plants to grow, they need nutrients found in the soil. The fertilizer adds nutrients to the soil, so the plants treated with fertilizer received more nutrients than the control plants, so they grew faster. So the second component, which is the scientific principle, seeks to explain the results of your experiment, seeks to support the claim you're making with scientific principles. In other words, it makes sense with everything we know about plants. Now, if you're an AP student, you might want to be a little more detailed. You may want to say, well, plants grow by making more cells. Cell division requires the synthesis of proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, such as DNA and RNA. While plants can obtain carbohydrates through photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, phospholipid, the components of cell membranes, protein and nucleic acid biosynthesis require sources of phosphorus and nitrogen, because phospholipids contain phosphorus and proteins and nucleic acids contain nitrogen. In addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, they contain the elements of phosphorus and nitrogen. Okay? Phosphorus and nitrogen can be found in the soil as a result of decomposers who break down dead organisms. Fertilizers are designed to enrich soil in phosphorus and nitrogen containing compounds. It is possible that without the fertilizer, the potting soil contained limiting amounts of sources for nitrogen and phosphorus, thereby limiting the rate of growth and these plants as compared to the ones exposed to fertilizer. So here in the reasoning, you're attempting to explain the results using scientific principles. This is the end of this lecture, and you will soon find out that in order to get better in writing these, you're going to have to practice, and you're going to have to practice a lot. But we are doing this together, so hopefully this was helpful to you. Good luck and goodbye.